All right, today we're looking at some of the events of the Cold War spanning from the 1970s through the 1980s. So we'll look at the Nixon presidency, some of his key foreign policy plans, and we'll look at what Ronald Reagan did in the 1980s in terms of his foreign policy plans in relation to the Cold War. Okay, so President Nixon kind of gets a bad rap in history for his domestic policies, what he did in the United States. He wasn't very popular during the Vietnam movement. There was the incident over Watergate in which Republicans broke into a Democratic headquarters and tried to steal some information. Nixon would have been impeached, probably removed from the presidency if he hadn't basically resigned. So in terms of domestic issues, Nixon not very popular, but he actually did a pretty decent job when it comes to foreign policy plans, especially with easing up the Cold War tensions between China and the United States. China, if you remember, became communist in 1949. It's a huge blow to the U.S. in terms of the Soviets gaining a major political and economic ally. And so in the 1970s, President Nixon is able to sort of open up some dialogue and begin talking about creating trade and opening up some diplomatic solutions between U.S. and Chinese relations, which hadn't been that great. The Korean War of the 1950s through 1953, that had created a lot of tension between the U.S. And obviously the North Koreans and the Chinese who were backing the North Koreans. So how does Nixon sort of get the ball rolling, so to speak? How does he break into China and get negotiations and begin opening dialogue with China? Of course, through ping pong. No, seriously, ping pong. So ping pong is huge in China. It's like their national sport. And Nixon basically sets up this arrangement where he's going to bring or allow the United States ping pong team to go play a friendly match against the Chinese national team. Here you can see a picture of the U.S. Ping pong team along the Great Wall of China. And then here's the Book of Table Tennis by Glenn Cohen, who is our U.S. top 10 ping pong player. And so it was a, kind of a let's be friends sort of gesture, and let's get together and play your national sport of ping pong. And this allows Nixon to travel to China and allows the sort of, ease the tensions, instead of being all serious about like, oh, we need to reduce nukes and we need to, demilitarize and we need to do this and that. It's more about like, hey, let's have a friendly game of ping pong and, we'll talk about things while we're at it too. So this became nicknamed ping pong diplomacy, actually. This is what really gets Nixon allowed into China and gets the ball rolling in terms of reducing Cold War tensions. Overall, ping pong diplomacy can be referred to as Nixon's overarching policy of easing, reducing Cold War tensions called détente, French word. Other examples of détente include the SALT agreements, the strategic arms limitation talks, and Nixon initiates that in 1972, not just with China, but with the Soviets as well. The idea, as the name implies, is to strategically limit the amount of nuclear arms that both the major superpowers have. So again, this easing of tension, to pull back and demilitarize both sides to reduce the chances that World War III could start or that we basically blow up the world. The other goal of détente under Nixon was to get China to open up and increase trade opportunities. China was a huge market. We wanted to sell goods to the Chinese, and we also wanted to allow Chinese goods into the U.S. market too. So the idea of increasing global trade, this is all part of Nixon's overall goal under détente. And then there's another SALT agreement in 1979, SALT II, under the Jimmy Carter administration. Okay, switching gears here to the late 70s and throughout the 80s, the Soviets versus Afghanistan. The Soviets were able to sort of keep the surrounding countries as their satellite nations. They were heavily influencing the surrounding countries. They were communist. It created that buffer zone between East and West, Europe, sort of the Iron Curtain that Churchill spoke of. When the Soviets were trying to get parts of parts of Asia to become part of its satellite nations. Afghanistan didn't want to do that. They put up a fight. They didn't want to become part of, under that Soviet sphere of influence. And so in 1979, the Soviets invade Afghanistan, and it's a huge setback for the United States and our détente policy. Everything seemed to be going well in terms of reducing the tensions and the military buildups, and then the Soviets go ahead and invade another country and basically try and force it to become communist. So the U.S. response is, well, diplomatically, we refuse to participate in the Summer Olympics in Moscow, and then the Soviets retaliate by not participating in our Summer Olympics in 1984 in Los Angeles. This war lasts 10 years, much like the United States has figured out in our fighting in Afghanistan. It's really hard to fight against a country that is using like guerrilla warfare tactics. It's very very rugged and mountainous terrain. It's very difficult to fight in Afghanistan, and the Soviets suffered the same fate back in the 80s. So the U.S. probably could have learned a lot from, or should have learned a lot about, the Soviets' involvement in Afghanistan back in the 80s. Basically, this war drains the military coffers for the Soviets. They can't afford to both build up their military and fight this massive war in Afghanistan at the same time, so it costs them a ton of money. The U.S. in this war also ends up providing a lot of military training, a lot of military supplies to the Afghan rebels and Afghan soldiers. So the money and the supplies that we give to help them fight out the Soviets actually turns out being the same sort of tactics and strategies in military that they used against us in our war against terror. So kind of a catch-22 there. Okay, moving on to the 1980s. We're just kind of glossing over a few of the events from the 1970s. We'll talk more about other issues related to the Cold War in class. In the 80s, Ronald Reagan, aka Dutch, used to be an actor in Hollywood, and he became president, so there you go. One of Reagan's legacies in relation to the Cold War is the huge amounts of money that he spent on the military. So where Nixon was and Carter, they were trying to reduce the amount of militarization and reduce military tensions between the Soviets and U.S. Reagan steps in and basically kicks it up to 20. He's going to revamp our military. He is going to initiate all sorts of defense programs. He's going to resupply our troops. He's going to just dump billions and billions, hundreds of billions of dollars into our military, kind of ramping up the Cold War again. One of the big programs that he initiates is Star Wars. Yep, he starts developing lightsabers and X-Wings and the whole 9 yards, and like he starts training Jedis, and you know, that's Ronald Reagan, so that really happened. This is all true. Absolutely. So no, not the Star Wars, but it became nicknamed Star Wars, the Strategic Defense Initiative, because basically what Reagan was trying to do and what the military was doing was literally put lasers on satellites that could shoot down Russian missiles that were launched high into orbit and, you know, aimed at the United States. This program was really ambitious. We didn't have the technology. I mean, the likelihood of this program ever being fully developed and coming to fruition was very unlikely, but the United States dumped billions and billions of dollars into developing this program, and eventually they just kind of gave up on it, especially towards the end when the Cold War was over. We're like, well, we don't really need to put lasers on satellites anymore, and it's costing billions, so let's scrap it. But in terms of impact on the Cold War, if you're the Soviets and you know that the U.S. is putting lasers on things up in space, that kind of freaks you out. There was this agreement to not militarize space, and here's the U.S. clearly saying, nope, we're going to definitely put lasers on satellites, so what's up, Soviet Union? So increases military for the U.S., helps further increase those tensions between the Soviets and the U.S. as well. So like I said, the Afghan war depletes the Soviets' ability to fight any wars. There's not enough money to go around to support the military, let alone support the people of the Soviet Union. So by the mid-'80s, the Soviets they really are in a tight spot. They need to transition away from sort of this militarization, arms race approach. They can't keep up anymore. The U.S. is pulling away. We're dumping billions into putting lasers in space, and meanwhile, the Soviets can't even put bread and food on people's tables. So in '85, Mikhail Gorbachev comes into power in the Soviet Union. and he's looking to be more of a reformer. He's going to kind of pull back the reins on spending and militarization, and he's looking to create some domestic reforms for the people as well. This really strict totalitarian dictatorship-like rule that's become synonymous with the Soviet Union throughout the decades. He's going to change that with this policy known as Glasnost. Glasnost means openness. He wants to allow the public, the people of the Soviet Union, to be able to speak out against the government, to sort of give suggestions on how the government can better reform and change the Soviet Union. He also initiates a program or this policy called perestroika. Perestroika is basically changing that communist economic and political system, and it's starting to introduce more democratic and capitalist elements. So it's a huge dramatic shift for the Soviet Union, both politically, socially, and it kind of takes a while for this adjustment to take hold, both for a lot of the old hardline political leaders who were like gung-ho Soviet Union and like communists, and also very difficult transition for a lot of the public too. But a lot of people were like, hey, this is pretty awesome. We can finally give some input on what our government's not doing, giving us food, and what they should be doing. And it's a really dramatic step for the Soviets. And it's a sign that the Cold War is coming to an end. If you've ever seen Rocky IV, think of Ivan Drago and that end scene where he's like holding up the guys in the corner, the Soviet trainers. And he basically throws them down on the ground. He's like, I fight for me now. And that's basically Glasnost. We'll check out that scene and it'll make more sense if you don't recall or haven't seen the movie. Other important issues during the Gorbachev era. He met with President Reagan, and in 1987 they agreed to basically shut down any intermediate and short-range missiles, the INF Treaty, which stands for the Intermediate Nuclear Force Treaty. Basically, the U.S. is going to pull some of their missile sites out of Europe, and the Soviets are going to pull back some of theirs. Again, a huge step forward in terms of demilitarizing, increasing better relations between the Soviets and the U.S. Again, Gorbachev really looking to change, looking to reform, and those really hardline Cold War policies. You also start to see by the late 80s, early 90s, all those satellite nations begin to break away. Countries like Poland and Belarus and all those other Eastern European countries are starting to say, hey, the communists, the Soviet Union cannot run its own country, let alone run a bunch of satellite nations as well. So those satellite nations were really poor, their economies were weak, they didn't have jobs, so they start to say, we're going to break away, we're going to kind of do our own thing. All right, they want their own autonomy, they want their own independence. And in 1991, Gorbachev basically resigns, and these reform policies, good or bad depending on who you were, but basically when he resigns, that's kind of it. The collapse of the Soviet Union was pretty much done, and now the Soviet Union is back to being Russia, and Boris Yeltsin comes in, and we have to sort of switch to this free market capitalist society, and it's a very, very slow, difficult transition for Russia to do that. So there's about a 10-year period where this transition phase and where Russia's kind of in limbo in terms of being a world power and having sort of economic and political power. But after that period, Russia reemerges as a huge political, economic force and a military force, and it kind of leads us to where we are today with U.S. and Russian relations, and as we start to see some more Cold War-like behavior between both Russia and the United States today. So that's just some of the key issues of the Cold War from the 70s and 80s. Like I said, we'll talk more about other issues in class. Again, just kind of sum up the Cold War legacy, the Red Scare of Joseph McCarthy, the bombing campaigns and containment policies of both Vietnam and the Korean War. You've got the arms race between the Soviets and the U.S., the buildup of nukes. You've got the Berlin Wall. You've got the development of the space programs, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, better known as NASA. That's still around today, all driven due to the Cold War era.